Okay, so it's preparing to live stream your meeting. I'm going to mute myself.
Mm-hmm. Meeting is now streaming live on YouTube. I'm guessing that means we're actually live.
There.
Hard to tell, isn't it? Just like, where's our fanfare when we come out on stage and there's just like a stadium of people waiting to talk about Schitt's Creek. I might give it like 30 more seconds before we start, just in case people are like catching up to the live stream.
Yeah.
Have you been doing many digital events so far?
No, this is the first digital one, actually. I did one talk for university and then one in real life event. What's that? And then this one. That is real life.
Oh, nice. Okay. So we're pretty much top of the list. Yeah. Love it. Okay. Seeing as it's now 2 minutes past, I'm guessing we can probably just crack on. Let's just pretend like a curtain has come up and the Schitt's Creek theme is playing and we're here. Welcome, everybody. I hope I am actually talking to an audience. Welcome, everybody, to this book event for Emily Garside's new book, Love That Journey for Me, The Queer Revolution of Schitt's Creek. My name is Aideen Lynch. I am an Irish poet based in Edinburgh, and I had the Recreation Queer Poetry Project. But more importantly, we have Emily Garside here to talk about her new book. Emily Garside, I'm just going to read this straight from the book, straight off the page. Emily Garside is a writer of many kinds, as well as a professional nerd. Emily spent a number of years as an academic and lecturer, beginning with her PhD on theatrical responses to the AIDS crisis and the evolution of LGBTQ theatre. Currently, she's working on 2 books related to her research. She now specializes in queer culture writing. As a journalist, she is a regular contributor for the Queer Review and has written for American Theatre, Slate, BBC, and The Stage. So, welcome, Emily. I'm really pleased that you're here. We get to talk about the book. A little bit of Zoom guidance for everybody who is streaming in from the cosmos. We're going to have a sort of very flexible event structure. We're going to have a bit of a chat. I'm going to invite Emily to read for about 5 minutes. We're going to have a bit more of a chat, and then there'll be time at the end for audience questions. So there should be a Q&A at the bottom of the screen that you can just put your questions into throughout the event. So we'll get around to them at the very, very end. So please just do be thinking of that as we're chatting, because I'm sure that no matter how long we sit here, we will not have all of the questions answered by the time we get there. So Love That Journey for Me, the very, very wonderful 404 inkling I have in my hands, dives deep into the cultural sensation of Canadian comedy drama Schitt's Creek, considering the fusion of existing sitcom traditions, references, and tropes. This inkling analyzes the nuance of the show and its surrounding cultural and societal impact as a queer revolution. By discussing how the show reshapes LGBTQ plus narratives from the crafting of the town itself and celebratory influences, including Cabaret, to how writer-creator Dan Levy utilized and subverted expectations throughout his work, Emily Garside showcases how one TV show became a watershed moment in queer representation and gay relationships on screen. So, Emily, for anybody out there who, might not have any idea what any of that means, what is Schitt's Creek and why did you write a book about it?
Good question. Both of them, good questions. I love the idea of people just like wandering in off the digital street going, who knows what this show is, but it's got a fun name. So let's hear someone talk about it for an hour. Sure. It's, as we mentioned, it's a Canadian comedy show. If we want to get nerdy, it's technically not a sitcom, but I had to reference it in terms of sitcoms. That's
controversial.
Yeah, niche levels of kind of, comedy layerings there. But it's created by father and son duo Eugene Levy and Daniel Levy. Eugene, known to my generation as American Pie Dad, I think, mostly. I don't know if it gets me kicked out of the club here, but I've never actually seen that film the whole way through. So, that might get me kicked out of the Eugene fan club. I don't know. I wasn't cool enough in high school, clearly. But the show tells the story of them as a father and son in the show, and from a wealthy family that loses all of their money in the first episode and gets kicked out of their, frankly, really ugly house in the very first sort of 30 seconds. It's so ugly. It's gold. Yeah. And they own a town because that's what you do when you've got so much money in the world. They bought it as a joke. Yeah, like who doesn't just own a town in, rural Ontario, basically, and just kind of, sure. But they have to move to this town that they own because it's the only place they can afford to live in. And the next sort of, 6 series of the show, kind of 3-ish years of their lives, we see them learning to be normal people. I mean, that's a loose definition there, but live in a normal town, and how being in the town sort of helps them learn about family, learn about each other, learn what they want in life. Some things never change, obviously, within them, because that would be a stretch too far. The mother figure, Moira, is equally as ridiculous in some respects when she leaves as when she arrives, but in an endearing way. In a way that we love. And then across that, we see stories of queerness in particularly David, who is the pansexual character, and we see him eventually find the love of his life and get married. And we see sort of that literally happy ending, as the last episode is called, for him as well. That was really neatly done, wasn't it?
That was very suave, yes. Amazing. So I'm going to invite you to read from the book in just a moment, but for our audiences at home, Emily and I also wanted to have a little bit of an acknowledgement before we really get into the discussion, about the fact that even though Schitt's Creek is quite notable for the fact that someone's identity or presentation is never really the butt of a joke, except for the white cis mayor Roland, but I feel like that in itself is sort of overturning the trope rather than reinforcing it. But there are some absences within our discussion if we're talking about queer revolution on TV. So Schitt's Creek is a show with all of its merits and accolades that still centers whiteness and non-disability. Though there are people of color in the town and throughout the series, the central characters are for the most part very privileged, non-disabled white people. So we'll be discussing queer representation in that frame, but then later on, Emily and I are also going to have a more sort of in-depth discussion about intersectionality as it's represented in the show, and particularly in reference to the Roses as a Jewish family being written by a Jewish creator. But it's important to sort of flag that right at the beginning. But for all of our many viewers, the stadium of viewers awaiting, Emily, do you want to read just a quick snippet from the book? And then we can launch into the interrogation.
Yes, absolutely. I asked my friends which section I should read from, and one of my friends said, read about TV mom and dad. So I'm going to read from the section on Johnny Rose, because that was what was voted for when I asked for opinions. So
democratic. Yes.
Yeah, the chapter's called Johnny Rose and Chosen Family, and I'm going to jump in a couple of pages in, talking about Johnny specifically. So Johnny loves his family deeply and openly, more openly than anyone else when we first meet them. Despite some notable shortcomings in his parenting throughout their lives, it's certain that providing for and caring for his family was always a priority. It's perhaps misdirected into work and consequent riches for a while, and is a lesson in personal growth, but it was always there. Once they get to the town, Johnny is willing to do anything and everything to both support his family and try and solve their problems. The fact that it doesn't always get it right only adds to his endearing appeal. We don't need him to win every time, but he never stops trying when it comes to his family. We also feel for Johnny as a parent and a husband who just wants to do right by his family. This comes back around again in season 6, when David, believing that things are now better, returns to assuming Johnny can pay for catering at his wedding as promised. Johnny's pain at not being able to do it isn't about the fancy beef dish, it's about him feeling like he's failing as a father. It extends beyond his blood family. We look to him predominantly as the father figure, but his story arc really is about anyone wanting to look after the ones he loves in whatever form that takes. For the Roses, the love has always been there. They just largely forgotten how to show that on the day-to-day. Although Johnny and Moira admittedly struggle at times with what we might call traditional parenthood of their own kids, they leave the town not only more involved parents, but having unofficially adopted both Stevie and Patrick as well. Moira as well might not be a traditional mum, but she still manages in her own unique way to take Stevie and Patrick under her wing. Though we don't see a lot of her with Patrick on screen, in the same way she tells David that Patrick sees him, there's a sense she's understanding of Patrick too. Cemented when she encourages him at his cabaret audition, but also later when Moira quietly reminds her son to take care to nurture his husband-to-be. Likewise, she quietly encourages Stevie in admittedly non-traditional maternal ways, such as encouraging her to take nude photos, but she's also the one to take action when Stevie's heartbroken over Amir. Johnny certainly is a father figure to Stevie, but Moira is the one who quietly lifted her up to be the woman she grows into. Not entirely separate to Johnny the father figure then is the marriage of the Roses. They are a perfect marriage of imperfect people, and a long-term one at that. There's no doubt that Moira is challenging to live with, and nobody pretends otherwise, least of all Johnny, who rolls his eyes and exclaims Moira, sometimes a bewildered sweetheart at regular intervals. Johnny doesn't understand everything Moira does, or even over several decades of marriage, but he doesn't have to because he loves her. Equally, Moira is not above telling Johnny exactly when she thinks she's being an idiot. By the end of the series, we also realise that the parents' marriage is what Alexis and David have, in a way, been looking for. Alexis doesn't have it yet because she needs to become the kind of person who would have that kind of relationship first. And David takes a while to realise that once he has it, he doesn't need all the other things he thought he did. For audiences, having a mum and dad on TV to look up to, and perhaps a surrogate for what's missing in their own lives, is a powerful thing. Not only does it give a moment of safety and comfort, also whether it's that your own parents got divorced or simply never got along as well as the Roses, we do learn from fictional role models as well as real life ones, and we do take comfort in them as well. For many reasons, many viewers feel connected to Johnny, and by extension Eugene, and his relationship to all of his kids on the show as part of this.
Oh, wow. I mean, you really have packed in a lot in that sort of quick section, because there's so much there about both biological family and chosen family, and learning how to support somebody in the way that they actually need to be supported. The thing that sticks out to me in the midst of all of that is the point you make about Moira and Stevie being the motel receptionist and then owner, who's very much the kind of introverted character, very dry, becomes very good friends with David early on. And the fact that Moira does sort of step in as a maternal figure for her, which is so like powerfully done in the Cabaret episode. I was just kind of curious, jumping off of that, how, just to talk a little bit more about this kind of the idea of, you know, there being a revolution in Schitt's Creek in terms of how family dynamics are portrayed, especially if you're coming from a sort of LGBTQ background, having that sort of depiction of different kinds of support being really empowering.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's the idea that sort of at any point in your life, someone can come into it who can be a sort of family. And it's not that, we don't get the impression with Stevie that she's like looking for anything, or she feels like she's missing that in her life particularly. But when it's presented to her, like she really does eventually sort of embrace it, and you realize how much she sort of, you know, loves the Roses, particularly Johnny, and how much she sort of comes to rely on them. There's the episode where Johnny thinks he's having a heart attack, and like Stevie's the most upset. Although Moira is, but she doesn't, she shows it in typical Moira fashion, but you can see how affected Stevie is by it. Roland's just buying snacks from the vending machine because
oh my gosh, yeah, that is really true. I'd kind of forgotten about that episode where she's like really upset in the hospital waiting room, and his actual kids are sort of like, what's wrong with you?
Nobody knows where Alexis is. David's halfway up a mountain getting proposed to, but like Stevie's there.
Okay, so I wanted to ask you a prepared question, but now we're talking about the proposal, so I have to ask you about that. That scene is so beautifully done. I whenever I return to Schitt's Creek, that's actually the scene that like gets me closest to being like really emotional. And I think it's that fantastic mix of, you know, Patrick has been this character introduced from the very beginning who is so open and so honest and so direct in a way that I think David sometimes struggles with. But one of the things that, back to the section you just sort of read aloud, is the conversation that David has with Moira about how they're so similar in essence. And she makes this point that, like, the way that she's learned to support Johnny is a way that David needs to learn to support Patrick, which again sort of reinforces that point you make about how having these supportive family structures, whether biological or chosen, makes such an enormous impact on the ways that you can then conduct relationships in other areas of your life. And the show does really capture that, I think, really powerfully. Sorry, we could just talk about David and Patrick all day, because I just have a real soft spot for both of them.
It's true. And it's that thing that they can, like, I think that David doesn't realize how much Patrick's like his dad until a bit later down the line, and is slightly horrified possibly that he may be marrying his dad, but also kind of can see the good in that as well, and the kind of, and can, I think eventually it sort of filters down into his brain that, like, yes, if my dad can cope with my mother, who is a lot to cope with on a given day, granted, then maybe this is the place I need to sort of be. But also there is a certain kind of, as much as they can be ridiculous, element of learning from them as role models. Like, actually, they've been married for like 40 years at this point and they're still really happy, despite living in a motel literally on top of each other for 2.5 years as well. Which, I don't know which one of them you'd end up murdering first in that motel if you were locked up with them initially. But it's a miracle, that the one dead body in the series isn't one of the Roses at some points, I think. But I think it's a really sweet learning curve for them all, of like, oh, I kind of like you people. Yeah.
Well, speaking of the Roses being stuck in a motel, one of the things that you pointed out in the book is that the show was kind of a sleepy hit. It was very much a kind of cult following until the 4th season. I think you said it was 2 million views. It finally hit in the 4th season. And one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, what was it about Schitt's Creek, you think, that particularly catered to a captive audience?
Yeah, I think because it kind of steadily then increased when it went to Netflix and sort of the 4th and 5th series, but obviously it was the final season when everyone was in lockdown that people started going crazy for it. And I think in part there was kind of, during lockdown, there was sort of the two sides of TV watching. One was like, watch something that's far more grim than reality, which is like the deep dark
true crime,
Netflix. And then it was watch either the most brainless reality TV or the most joyous thing that you can find. And there was nothing in between. And I think the sheer joy of the show, and also the fact that it was 20 minutes long, probably helped as well, because attention spans went to hell as well. Yeah. But it was that thing of like, you could spend 20 minutes maybe in your lunchtime because you're working from home, you're stuck in the house all day, and you can go, oh, I can have 20 minutes where like nothing bad is going to happen and I'll probably laugh. Like, that's really comforting, I think, in the kind of the dark times, and even in the couple of years running up to it, because let's face it, it wasn't the greatest couple of years, even pre-2020 in the state of the world in general. So I think it was that thing of something sweet and joyous, and also this like nice protective bubble of kind of good stuff happening was a really nice thing to have. And also the idea that I think once people knew what a joy the kind of final season was, this idea that you can escape back into that joyous thing over and over again when the world feels a bit awful or a lot awful, depending on the time of day. Like, I think that really is something that helped it and made it a place people just wanted to hang out in, I think.
Yeah, that's a very good point, actually. And there's just so much sort of feel-good storylines that don't center on catastrophic conflict or misery, that so much of Schitt's Creek is fueled by people having character arcs that center on finding their joy and finding their purpose in life, and not considering so much the kinds of external pressures that the Roses felt before they moved to Schitt's Creek.
Yeah, and I think actually it's also in that vein that it's contemporary, but it's also not referencing anything of the wider world. It does mainly, it references celebrities and stuff like that, but it's kind of, it's everywhere. It's a bit like The Town is like nowhere in particular, but could be anywhere. It's kind of, it could be set any particular year in, you know, a frame, and that was a good escape, I think, in that there was no, it wasn't like shows like Grey's Anatomy that decided to do a COVID season, for example, which like nobody asked for that. Nobody.
We didn't want it.
You know, like it was that level of escape of like, I don't need the drama or the comedy I'm watching to reference what the world looks like. I'm watching this to escape. And I think that was a thing in its favor as well, that it kind of exists in a bubble somewhere.
That's something that the book kind of acknowledged that I hadn't fully consciously figured out when I was watching the show, which is that though Schitt's Creek is not a utopia, it's still creating a world that does seem to be free of the kinds of like discrimination or prejudice that would otherwise be very present in a TV show that centers queer characters. Like, I think you mentioned in the first season, David is being invited to like a tailgate sort of event. And he says, no, thank you. I don't feel like being hate crimed. But that never happens in the show. And that felt like such an absolute relief because of so many shows that bring in queer characters and then just go, okay, kill the gays, make them miserable. Someone's going to marry a straight person. It's just going to be downhill from here. But that never happens in Schitt's Creek.
No. And it's kind of, it's such a welcome relief. Like nobody, you know, nobody calls anyone a bad name even at any point. Not like, you know, it's none of those things. And it's not kind of, you know, we all grew up with the kind of sitcoms where sort of, you know, being assumed you were queer in some respect was always the butt of a joke. Like,
yeah, like Chandler and Friends, or yeah,
just like any sitcom like that. I've been rewatching Friends, and I've just watched an episode where it's like everyone thinks Chandler's gay, and the whole running joke from the episode is like, oh, what is it about me? And it's like there's nothing like that in this show, and that's what feels really refreshing. And it's the kind of idea of that it acknowledges that that happens. It's not just pretending we've like wiped this from the universe somehow, but it's kind of going, oh, but actually people can just choose to be nice and not do that. And kind of, I don't know, it almost feels like in a good way, like no one in this town can be bothered to be honest. Like it's kind of like that. They're just like really chilled and just like, oh no, it'd be too much effort to be like mean to someone. Why would we do that? Like, let's just go and get drunk in the field, whatever they're doing there. There's not much else to do. But you know, it's kind of a lovely idea that people just went, nah, let's not do that. Like, what a revolutionary idea of like, let's just not be mean to people.
Bizarrely, but it is really notable that that never becomes a sort of obstacle in the show, which that is sort of reminding me of, you know, a couple of points you make about how other TV shows do sort of have this lazy storytelling where coming out is a plot point, and it's always presented as a kind of traumatic event or as an overly dramatic one. But that coming out is not a single event and in isolation, that it's usually a sort of lifelong commitment. And I was wondering,
you've got to sign up for the full thing.
You've got to get the membership card. I was wondering how you think Schitt's Creek handles coming out stories and the presence of other sexualities.
Yeah, I think it handles it in such a wonderfully, in some ways, again, quite offhand way that's beautiful in the sense that like it just is what it is, but also it kind of highlighted for me that sense of, you know, you don't just come out once when you're a teenager. Like David has the funny line later on when he's just like, oh, I just brought a couple home and that was it to my parents, but which is like, yeah, sure. But actually he has to come out to Stevie when he's sort of, you know, after he's had sex with her, which again is like a bit of it's a great comedy kind of reverse moment of like, hang on a second. But it's the fact he's moved to a new town. He doesn't know this woman and now she has questions, you know, understandably so. She's made some assumptions. Like the show doesn't assume that people magically know people's sexualities or anything like that. It's the sense of like, from everything and the way David's mannerisms, the way he dresses, etc., Stevie has made an assumption, as people do, but then they've had sex, so now she's got questions, and that's fine. And that's kind of a conversation that you have time and time again in life as a queer person, and kind of whether it's someone you're dating, whether it's just a new friend. And I think even that moment in another show could have gone another way. Like, you'd have had this woman being really angry that she didn't know everything about this man before they, you know, got really stoned and hooked up, basically. You know, if that's what you're going to do on a Friday night or whatever it was, like, yeah, like, you didn't stop to ask questions there, fine, it happens. But it's that thing of like, in another show that would have been a completely different direction, and they handle it in a really lovely way of kind of like, oh no, she's completely fine with it, she just wanted to know. But that idea that you're coming out time and time again, and even that the Roses as parents are coming out on David's behalf to their friends that they've made when they talk to Roland and Jocelyn. Again, you get the idea that in another show that would have been such drama. It would have been like the torture of the parents who've got a queer son, and like, oh, or it would have been, you know, these townsfolk have reacted really badly, and, you know, what are we going to do? But actually, you know, Roland just gets stoned and eats some barbecue and it's fine, because yeah. But I think it's a lovely thing that that kind of coming out is dealt with in a lovely sort of light touch way, but that's really actually powerful for anyone who knows that feeling and what that means and all of that kind of stuff, which is, you know, a lovely thing to have. And then obviously we've got the flip side, which is Patrick's coming out, which is a much more emotional moment in the show, and probably like one of the best written episodes of the whole series, and the most sort of sensitively written stories. But just that they do a coming out story for a person who's not a teenager feels so refreshing, because I love so much that there are shows for teenagers now where there are kids coming out and they're in high school and you get to see that. But also it's the idea of like, well, that doesn't happen for everyone like that. And either because you didn't figure it out, or because life and whatever. And it's kind of a really lovely thing that you get someone who's so sure of their life in many ways, then being like completely, you know, the rug pulled from under him in terms of like, I don't know how to approach this. But it's a really sweet, honest sort of thing. And even though he makes maybe mistakes in his relationship with all of that, it's kind of that thing of it's from a very honest place and a very kind of believable place, that like, no, you could see how you get from A to B like this if this is the situation you landed yourself in. And then obviously it still ends happily is a wonderful thing and a reassuring thing. But I think that it doesn't in that episode either shy away from the fear that's there as well, which feels like an important thing to sort of balance all the comedy and all the sweetness of it, which is what makes it work so well, I think.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think you make a really good point there, in that it does seem as quite an outlier to the kinds of North American TV shows that we're accustomed to, like Friends or Glee or Gilmore Girls or How I Met Your Mother, where they all at one point or another sort of fall prey to stereotypes or outright homophobic jokes. And the fact that like Dan Levy is creating this world where queerness is not a plot point, but like character context. And I think that the line you had was in the book was really useful, was prejudice isn't removed from this equation by pretense it doesn't exist, but in the town's refusal to respond negatively to normality. And I do feel like that needs to be celebrated. So like there is such a sort of dearth of queer TV or film that centers queer joy rather than queer disdain or grief or pain or loss. But, you know, to come back to the point that we made in the beginning, we wanted to talk a little bit more about intersectionality and the kind of nuances of what queer representation means in this show. And I wanted to invite you to sort of talk a little bit more about, while this show does center prejudiced, non-disabled white characters, there is sort of a bit more to speak about in terms of the fact that it is centering Jewish characters from a Jewish creator also.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think that's one of the things, the main criticisms of the show is the lack of intersectionality, and that's an absolutely valid criticism, particularly in terms of, you know, diversity of characters and sort of in terms of race, particularly, even if you are in rural Ontario, like that's not necessarily an excuse. And it's a sort of a double-edged thing, in that you kind of look back and go, well, actually the sort of start of this show was written coming up for 9 years ago, and you think about the massive change in dialogue for TV and society we've had since, and you can kind of go, okay, I can see why in its initial seedlings, like maybe there weren't the conversations happening, and that actually if it was remade today, or whatever Dan Levy makes next, etc., you feel like the conversations will be there on seeing the way he and other writers from the show as well sort of talk about and embrace that.
Which he's acknowledged too in an interview, hasn't he?
Yeah, like he's talked about numerous elements of it over various interviews and stuff like that. So I feel like there's an idea of like being aware of like where this wasn't as good as it could have been, because, you know, we all live and learn, etc. And I feel like, you know, probably other writers who've been on that show as well have gone through a similar experience. I know some of the writers then went on to work on Kim's Convenience, which obviously centers a Korean family, had its own set of troubles at the end of its run with the way that things ended, but equally, you know, have probably learned things there. David West Reed went on to recently to write Anne Juliet, which is a musical that's just recently rewritten itself in terms of a non-binary character that they had in the show, recast it more appropriately, had the conversations, etc. So you feel like there are pockets of the writers from this show who have obviously been able to learn as they go and are embracing that. So that's a really good thing to see. And then equally, as we've said, kind of, you know, it is a show that centers a Jewish family, or actually sort of a sort of interfaith family as well, in that they mirror, you know, Dan and Eugene's family in sort of real life, in that Eugene's wife isn't Jewish either. But it's that idea of, we don't talk about necessarily the ideas of anti-Semitism and racism around Jewish identities on TV as much as we possibly should as well when we're having these conversations. And I think that's always an important one to flag up with this show, because yes, all of the other stuff is valid, but that's a really sort of interesting conversation that we probably should be having around representation as well, to just throw into the mix and not forget, I think.
Yeah. And there's, I think, like, bouncing off of that too, there's an increasing sort of discussions about queer Judaism and the ways in which religion and queerness are intersecting rather than, you know, seen as being in conflict in some way.
Yeah.
I think that's very well put. And, you know, the fact that a lot of queer TV and film has come on leaps and bounds in the last 8 or 9 years. There's, you know, off the top of my head, I can think of shows like Euphoria or It's a Sin, or so many other ones that have done so much for queer representation, but like we still acknowledge that the representation for queer people of color has much, much further to go. Yeah. But I also wanted to ask about, obviously, queer aesthetics in this show, because I mean, just the fact that like this is a show that delves into camp and drag and fashion in really novel and remarkable ways. I recently watched the sort of extra Schitt's Creek Netflix thingy that's like a half an hour about behind the scenes of the last season. And it struck me how much they do invest in both time and money on clothing and the ways that David and Moira are dressed and what those mean for the scenes that those costumes are appearing in and how that reflects the character's internal landscape. So I wanted to ask you just talk a little bit more about how Schitt's Creek plays with presentation and queer aesthetics and how that showcases characterization.
Sure. I mean, like you say, it's something that's sort of woven into the show and the characters. And I think that's it's a beautiful sort of element that if you sort of, you know it, or you understand sort of fashion and sort of storytelling of that side, or if you understand sort of the way queerness and outfits and fashion are sort of intersect as well, it's a wonderful thing. And if you don't, it's still fabulous to look at, and that's like equally valid and important as well. But the idea that like the characters' clothes tells a story parallel to sort of what they're talking about, and kind of also that can betray or illuminate kind of what else is going on with them at a given point is a wonderful thing. So kind of like one of my favorite things to sort of read is kind of when Moira is being like Moira Rose versus being Moira, and like the difference between how done up she is, whether she's got a wig on, what her makeup looks like, which varies, you know, depending on situations and stuff like that, the type of outfit that she's wearing and all of that you can sort of follow through all of it in that way. And the fact that like she's still got a certain camp aesthetic to her, even when she's being like off-duty Moira, you know, she lounges around the motel with her like brooches on her pajamas and whatnot.
Don't you? Just lounge around in formal wear.
Obviously. But the difference between them, you know, wigs, as much as we associate them with drag queens a lot of time and drag kings, there's also there's a history of queer women and wigs in society as well that's really under researched and under talked about. And in a similar way that queer men in going out to, you know, certain establishments and things like that, when it was an underground scene, the wearing of wigs for women was another kind of signifier in that scene and things like that. So there's a whole, like, you know, other element aside from the wonderfully like drag adjacent aesthetic that Moira has. And I love that loads of drag queens have started being Moira in various ways. That's like glorious. But equally, David's clothes tell a really sort of clear story across the series as well, going from kind of his much more sort of formal buttoned up outfits in the early seasons, and you see him literally softening in terms of his clothes and getting like fluffier, but also the sort of the gender lines in his clothes continue to sort of merge and bleed across the series. And it's not just that he like one day sticks a skirt on and that's it. It's that mix of things that just kind of start to evolve into their own sort of language for him almost, which is like a lovely thing to see. And kind of, you know, there's so much that you can sort of say about like the different sweaters that he wears and stuff like that. But it also comes back to kind of this idea of like signifying things with clothes for queer people, which is like a huge deal and always has been, whether it's like in clubs or whether just out on the street, different ways that queer people use signifiers on their clothing. It's just a beautiful kind of evolution of that, really, which is fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, we mentioned the proposal scene at the beginning of this chat, and I literally just watched it before we had this call, and it struck me that like they're going on a hike and Patrick is wearing, you know, very practical outdoor wear and his hiking boots and jeans and a light t-shirt. And David is wearing a long sleeved black fluffy, well, it's got like layers of fluffy like Angora wool or something in between what I can assume is cotton, and then like black leggings and fashion shoes. And I was just like, this is personally targeting me, because this is how I dress to go hiking, because I'm not outdoorsy. But it does say so much about the two of them, you know, that Patrick was like, this was supposed to be a picnic. Like, I told you we were going for a hike. And how that's perfectly portrayed in the clothes that they wear. And yeah, I think that's a really wonderful section you have in the book as well, you know, really going into the nuances of how those things come across in the show. And like when the motel is it on fire, or there's some kind
of like a fire alarm that goes off and she's in the closet, which again, like the metaphors of her hiding in the closet and screaming for her wigs, like we could like unpick that all day in it, and kind of, but it's like, yeah, what I have to rescue, and even actually when they're like literally leaving their children behind, she's checking in on the wigs and how they will like get shipped to her as well, because it's like we've all changed, but we've not changed that much, like let's be real. Glorious thing.
Well, you know, trailing on from that as well, this idea of like queer histories and flagging and different kinds of presentations, we have to talk about the Cabaret episode. We absolutely have to talk about the Cabaret episode. But before we do, I want to give a wee shout out to some of the people who've been in the chat. I think we've got Heather Rice watching in Ohio, who says, congrats on the book, Emily. And Rosemary tuning in from Delaware, and Ayushi in India. So, wow, oh my gosh. Hello, everybody across the world. You're very, very welcome. You've come just in time for the Cabaret section. So the Cabaret episode is one, I don't know if I'm naive, but when I was watching Schitt's Creek and they were talking about the fact that they were putting on a production of Cabaret, I wasn't expecting to see musical numbers in the episode. Just sort of assumed it would have been like a sort of backstage Rosencrantz and Guildenstern sort of thing. And I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about why do the queers love musicals? What is it? What does this play within a play do for queer visibility in Schitt's Creek? And what is basically, just tell us about Cabaret episode.
Sure.
I also love that you've got it like very carefully.
Yeah, like I thought I put my both Alan Cumming Cabaret, which I've had
Amazing.
for like about 20 years, and Patrick Cabaret, which is from a lovely artist who I'll give a shout out to called Geeky Schitt on Etsy, because she does some really cute like stuff.
Nice.
I love Cabaret Patrick, he's adorable. But I thought I'd put him next to like Alan Cumming there, just I went, oh god, why did the gays love musicals? Like that's actually half of my PhD, I think, possibly. Like we have no answers, but yeah. Like also like the musical theatre episode of TV, I feel like this one undoes a lot of bad episodes for me, like karmically. I think it cleansed some stuff that I have seen and I can't unsee. Grey's Anatomy, again, I'm looking at you.
Oh my god, let's not even talk about it.
I'm staring at Grey's Anatomy.
Cringe.
Yeah. Because it's become a thing and we blame Buffy for it with love. But like the musical theatre episode of a TV show has become a thing. And I love that because I'm a musical nerd, but also I cringe at it sometimes because it can be awful. And I think this did it with such a sense of love for the heritage of that musical that it worked, and that it also wove it into the fabric of the show rather than just going, and a musical for no apparent reason. Or like, I mean, thank God they didn't turn it into like the Buffy style, like everybody in the world starts singing, because that would have been horrific, I feel, with all love to everybody involved. Didn't need to see that. But the idea of kind of the minute they say it, like if you'd heard that they were going to do a musical episode or a musical was going to be in it, and the minute that they say it's Cabaret, it just makes so much sense. Partly because I think the need to see Moira as Liza was kind of up there for me. I mean, we got to see her in the outfit at least, which was, yeah, beautiful. But the idea that Moira becomes almost Bob Fosse as well, like that's both messed up and brilliant all at once.
Yes.
In sort of fusing worlds. But for anyone who doesn't know, like Cabaret has such a long through line in queer history in that it's semi-autobiographical from Christopher Isherwood, who wrote it about his time in Berlin pre-war. Isherwood then went on to be one of the first sort of big openly gay sort of writers in America, who was openly out in his lifetime and still publishing, unlike a lot of writers who were around that time. And then obviously it became a play, then a musical, then a film with Liza, then a musical on stage again, and became increasingly camp once Liza got involved, obviously. But it has a long history with sort of queer performers, and sort of the iconic one for me is Alan Cumming, who did the 1990s version, who just is the living embodiment of the MC in just in life generally. But the idea that there are links to, you know, a lot of the people who've taken on the role of the MC have sort of queerness sort of in them, or have like connections to the queer community. And I love that about that role. And I love that in Schitt's Creek, they gave that to Patrick to give him like that moment of kind of, this is never going to be who you are as a human, but try it on for size almost. That kind of, you've not lived a queer life up until now, go forth and like do that.
And he is very attractive as the MC.
He is. It is my, I've said this before and I've been proven wrong by my friends, but I always say like any man who plays the MC is automatically incredibly attractive.
Oh yeah.
My friends have then listed to me all the people who have played the MC who are actually not particularly attractive in many ways.
Alan Cumming and Noah Reid.
Yeah, just like we don't need to sort of, break it up in that way. But it's kind of like, yeah, he's so wonderfully attractive in it. Obviously he's got like charisma and the ability to sing and all of that things, maybe not to dance quite as eloquently as some might.
Better than me, that's all I'm saying.
It works.
Yeah.
But it's that idea of kind of handing him as a character that opportunity to embrace that side of life, even if he never does it again, anything close to it. It's to sort of escape into that. And it feels like a lovely full circle moment for him, having, just come out, just proposed to David, and kind of go, have this moment literally in the spotlight and embrace this sort of side of yourself for a minute as well, which is wonderful. While Moira waits in the wings, in the wig, ready to be Liza, just in case.
It is such a wonderful moment to see that happen, because we have just seen Patrick being quite normcore for most of the series, and then having this season episode where there's no fanfare around the fact that he's playing the MC. There's no drama about the fact that he's taking on this role and presenting in this way. It's just like, it's so unspoken and so implied that like, this is just what he wants to do. So I want to give another quick shout out. I mean, this may come as some surprise, Emily, but we do have some queer people in the audience.
Wow.
I know. I did not see them coming. But I wanted to give a shout out to Abs, who's apparently watching from Scotland with their girlfriend. So hello, Abs. Very welcome. My last question for you is, what is your favorite piece of trivia from your troves of knowledge about Schitt's Creek?
Oh, I think I spent ages thinking about this. Like, what is like my favorite piece of trivia? I think I've come up with two. One's a serious one and one's just like a stupid one that amuses me.
Excellent.
My favorite like fun behind the scenes fact is that when they filmed Patrick singing in the open mic night, Catherine O'Hara gave him the advice to ask to film the audience first rather than him, because you'll get their honest reaction to the first time they hear it. And that wasn't how it was planned, but then he had a chat with the director and they managed to do it. So a lot of the reactions you see are the reactions to them hearing it the first time, which I think is a lovely touch. And I think Noah Reid went on to say that was good because it gave him a couple of goes at it before he actually had to get it, like, nail it for the sort of filming of it. And then my silly favorite one is Moira's crown when she's at the Crows premiere is actually made out of cable ties sprayed gold or silver, whatever color they are in it, like cut off and stuck to a headband. And that's a stupid little fact that I love.
That's amazing. Oh my gosh, cable tied. Phenomenal. Well, thank you for answering all of my very serious questions. We're going to open up for audience questions for the last 15 minutes. If we do hit 8 o'clock, I'll give a sort of warning shout, and anybody who needs to leave can leave and come back because this is all being recorded. So if you do have to jet off at 8, you can come back and watch the last bit after. So one of our first questions, I think, was from Kay. How did Emily come to turn the love of the show into a book?
Good question. So a year ago, almost to the day, I was working on another book, which had a deadline for October the 1st, and I was losing my mind slowly. Not slowly, I'd lost my mind by this point. I was writing my book on Angels in America, which is based on my PhD work, but it's like, it's heavy. Like, it's heavy. And I'd been watching Schitt's Creek, and I'd used this watching the final season as my bribery for finishing that book. So I wouldn't let myself watch the final season, which came over here in like June, until I finished that book. At the time as well, some of my friends started joking about the fact, like, clearly you want to write a book about Schitt's Creek as well, because I'd become like really obsessed with it. I was like, no, don't be ridiculous. I'm just finishing this book. Like, leave me alone. And then sort of two things happened in that I quoted Dan Levy in my Angels in America book, which kind of unlocked a huge argument for me that I was struggling with. And I was like, I don't know if I'm going to get away with this, but I'm going to put it in. And nobody, touch wood, has objected so far. So we'll see if it stays in forever. And then I just kind of went like, oh God, you know what? I think I have gone off at the deep end about this show. Yeah, I think I need to like think about doing something. And actually initially I was going to just write about Cabaret, and I was going to do it for the Queer Review, because I have an annoying habit of emailing my editor there being like, I've got an idea. Let me do this thing. And he was totally on board, because they hadn't written, and still haven't, which is my fault, written about the show as a like wrap up sort of after it finished. They just wrote about like the Emmy Awards and stuff like that. And then I sort of pitched that and said, oh, but could I do a deep dive into Cabaret if I do that for you? And he said, yeah. And then I started thinking about a more academic book, a longer book. And then the Inklings sort of call out came, in sort of October, November last year. And I literally just chucked it in on a whim, if I'm perfectly honest. Kind of went, well, what's the worst that can happen while I'm working on like bigger projects around this, or thinking about what it could be in a bigger form? I just chucked it in for that and saw what happened. And that's how sort of it happened. But really it was me going like, oh God, I've got to write something about this, because clearly my brain has gone off at the deep end somewhere.
I mean, that's a very useful way to put a hyperfixation into a project that actually leads somewhere, because I just write fan fiction. I mean,
I might do that too, but Listen,
that's a question
for another day.
That's a separate event. So Gabby has a question. Gabby has a question about the fashion significance of Patrick's jeans. Please and thank you. This chat has been incredible. Thank you both. You're welcome, Gabby.
I love you, Gabby. That's a brilliant question. This did get cut from the book in that I wanted to write about the fact that as much as we joke about Patrick's straight-legged, very tight denim at times, the idea that actually that is a form of queer expression in that he wears a uniform that's very much like clones, which is a kind of aesthetic style for gay men in the 70s. They often would also have a mustache. Didn't go that far, but it's kind of reminiscent of that look, which was the very buttoned up, straight jeans, blending in, very, very hyper masculine in some ways, which does link to when David's like uses his clothes to say he's not interested in me, because for him these two things have connected in his brain, that like he dresses very straight but he's not made that leap back around. But equally there was like lots of sort of coding in the way that you dressed even within that subset of queer fashion, which I find really fascinating, and to the extent of like buttonholes you'd wear, which actually Elliot Page reflected in his Met Gala outfit, which was
Reincarnation,
which was beautiful. And you'd add on things like handkerchiefs in your pocket, keys and where you clip them, and when they go and look at the wedding venue, he clips his keys onto his belt, and I was like, oh, that's exciting. The things that get me excited in life, honestly. But all of that is like a mishmash of other references to the way queer men dress historically, and kind of nods to possibly as well like closeted queer men at different points as well, in terms of, you know, the way that you dress and all of that. So I find that, as much as it's fun to joke about his tight jeans that he wears for the entire thing and the shades of blue that he wears, I think there's something in his clothes as much as there are David's, which is fascinating.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So Avery Watson says they're very glad that they've never seen Grey's Anatomy, LOL.
Don't do it to yourself. Don't do it.
Just skip it. But they also ask, I also think it's interesting that they chose Cabaret, seeing as it has more explicitly queer characters than other musicals. I wonder what the reasoning behind that was.
Yeah, I find that interesting too, because for anyone who knows the history of Cabaret as well, like Cliff, who's in the story, has been basically in and out of the closet in terms of the way they've put together that show. The creators have spoken about it since and sort of said if they were redoing it, then they'd just make him a queer character and be done with it, essentially, which is nice to know. Whether that will now play into future productions is another story. But I feel like it must have been a motivation. I think it must have been a set of conversations as like which musicals fit this town and this show. And there's only a handful really that you can kind of go, oh, there are a bunch of overtly queer characters that would work for this. I'm glad that they never chose Rent, because that was half of my PhD and I would have actually lost my mind because I would have been too fussy about that and maybe written angry emails. I don't know.
I actually can't deal with Rent. I watched Rent for the first time during lockdown and I can't cope with Rent at all.
That's the book I'm working on now, and I'm going to lose my mind again slightly, and I don't know, have to find something else to distract myself. But yeah, I'm trying to think of other like sort of queer musicals that you could have done is really difficult, actually, kind of ones that would fit and have enough of that.
What if they had done Phantom of the Opera?
I see it, like, you know, Moira would want to be Christine, so.
Oh my God, Moira would want to be the Phantom.
Yes.
Heather Wright also has a question. After watching and rewatching, we're right there with you. Is there more you want to add to the book? Like, do you have a second edition with another chapter?
I do very much want to do more, and I am still hoping to have the sort of longer version that I was originally looking to write, essentially, which would be not a traditional academic book, but a kind of, you know, a full-length book. But I want to use that to look at the bigger picture of the show. So I want to look at it in comedy history. I want to look at it in terms of how fans have responded and the importance to fans. want to write about fan fiction in it because I always want to do that kind of stuff. So I really want to write something that's bigger than the show, if that makes sense. But as well, there's plenty left in terms of the show that I could also write about. So I'm hopeful it's not the end.
That was a real tease. That was a real tease. Okay. I feel like for this question, I have to like have a table and put my hands on. What do you think of Alexis as a camp character? Outlandish stories, a little bit Alexis, etc.
Yes, I love that, Charlotte. Like the idea that she gets quite overlooked in terms of like actually being a camp figure in that sense, in that she's like, I know the show was sort of based around or she based some of the character around the Kardashians and stuff, and they are, whatever else we may think about the Kardashians, incredibly camp in some ways in terms of the over-the-top outlandishness of them. And I love that Annie really leaned into that, because I think you could have come at that character and been really unlikable, obviously, but I think also the way she makes her just ridiculous enough that it fits this world. And you kind of also go, as much as she's not as much like Moira as David is, you go, oh, I get how you're related. I get how you made, that makes sense. And that kind of element of her is really it's like a slightly different form of campness to the others in the family, and it's a beautiful thing to see. And the kind of the ridiculous life she's led is also like in that world of campness as well, of just, you know, chasing after extremes of life is a very, you know, camp way of living your life in that sense. So yeah, I think she's brilliant, and also has wonderful character growth, and it's a beautiful thing to see for a female character, especially a younger one, to have such an arc as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. She's got like such a refreshing character arc throughout the season. I think she's one of the most unlikable characters at the beginning. Yeah. And then she has such a development over the course of the 6 seasons. And I think it sort of starts with the episode where she and David are going to get his driving license.
Yes. Yeah.
It's a really sweet like moment, and then it sort of comes full circle in the wedding when she tells him I love you, and he just goes
yes, yeah. And just that, you know, you get a female character who gets to walk off on her own in the end and not have to walk off on the arm of a man, as much as her and Ted are beautiful. Yes. And like, again, like that's what sort of our imaginations are for. Maybe they find each other down the line, maybe it works out, but it's that she doesn't have to do the like Rachel, I got off the plane moment and run back to the man to have her ending. It's lovely.
It's really lovely. And I think so much more like wholesome, because it's not prioritizing a romantic relationship over her selfhood, which is again unusual for TV. Heather Rice wanted to say, I love that, Emily, about the second book. We're all waiting for more. Ayushi in India is asking, do you think Patrick defies stereotypes of traditionally gay characters in terms of clothing? Like he's not camp or effeminate in the traditional sense, and you know there isn't like the femphobia associated with that. He defies stereotypes of traditionally gay characters that we've seen throughout queer cinema.
Yeah, that makes sense. It does make a lot of sense. And I think there's a lot in the fact that Noah Reid has said he just plays him as a guy falling in love. And I think that's a really refreshing take from a straight actor playing a role of someone who's in a queer relationship, of going, I'm not changing anything fundamentally about the character that I've decided on, about my mannerisms as an actor, etc., etc. I'm just going to play the love between me and this character, or, whatever it might be. And I think that is a real point in his favor as a character, and the idea that it kind of, they also seem to have worked with sort of that natural chemistry that him and Dan have as well, in that it just obviously just clicked between them as actors, which is a wonderful thing to see. And you can't engineer that type of chemistry either. But I think that's a point in sort of what led Patrick to be so not stereotypical, in that if you're writing then on an actor that you know and you trust, it's that thing of kind of, oh, I can just give him this line and he will be, a sarcastic little troll that he is, and that's fine, but he won't try and make it into something else. Or even like when they're flirting, like he flirts just as Patrick as he is. It's not like I'm Patrick now flirting with a man and I've got to like layer some weird campness over it that doesn't fit my identity as the character I've created. And it's really confusing, but also really lovely to kind of have just this idea of, you know, we talk all the time, I think, about characters who just happen to be queer in whatever sense that means, and that oftentimes the minute that becomes part of their storyline, their personality starts to change somehow. Whereas, yeah, with Patrick, we just got this very honest portrayal of like, nope, he changes the least out of many of the characters in the show, partly because he arrives much more fully formed than other people do, much more grown up in some ways than some people. But he doesn't need to evolve in that sense. His evolution is about his relationship and all of that kind of stuff. So his personality stays consistent. And I think that's a wonderful thing to see. And to see this guy who is just this baseball loving kind of beer drinking, all he wanted for his bachelor party was to have some shots and go to an escape room, which I love him for. Just wanted to get really drunk, like fine. And just that kind of, none of that changes who he is as a person, as much as I think sometimes David would quite like to change some of those things about him.
I also love that now Schitt's Creek and Feel Good have both centered queer people having panics in escape rooms. Is that the new trope? We have hit 8 o'clock, so anybody who does need to leave, please feel free to leave. But we've got a couple more questions that I think Emily and I are probably just going to wrap up before we officially sign off. Awesome. I usually had another great question, and I meant to think of this. I didn't write it down, but I did mean to say it. I was asking, what do you think of that scene between Patrick and David in season 6, where Patrick says he wants to have a baby, not make a baby? Does it have a broader message to convey in terms of queer parenting?
Interesting. I reread the book bit in the book that I talk about that in earlier when I was trying to figure it out, and I can't express how much I love that moment so very much in the show. As someone who has never wanted children and has had every insult thrown at me for that as well, and also the pressure you feel even as a queer person, or more so in some ways, because like it's a non-traditional route to parenthood. It's that idea of like, well, you've got to sort that out. And it's like, I don't want to sort it out. Like, I don't want it. But I thought actually the strength of that conversation was that Patrick accepts it and kind of goes, it's not a deal breaker. It's fine. Like, obviously for some people it would be a deal breaker, and that's a conversation to have. But the fact that he goes, I know this about you. I didn't care 6 months ago. I don't care now. And it doesn't change anything between them, is such a beautiful thing. And I think it might also be a comment more, not so much on queer parenting, but the idea of like the pressure on all people, whether you're in a queer relationship or a heterosexual one, that this very traditional family dynamic is being handed down to queer people. And I think it's more a comment on like, that's still the only acceptable face of queer family dynamics. Dare I say it, that really irks me as well in life.
The homonormative family,
yeah, the idea of kind of, oh yes, it's if you want, you know, and it's that idea that you can't sort of pick and choose the elements. So yeah, they choose to have the, you know, the big white wedding and all of that kind of stuff, which is very heteronormative, but then they're choosing not to then do the next step as it's seen by everybody and have a baby. And I think that's a lovely comment from the show of kind of going, you don't have to do all of it, and you don't have to follow the straight line, pardon the pun, unintentionally, of kind of, you've done this one, so you've got to do this one. Because I think on other shows as well, it would be the idea of kind of, oh, well, you either are the rebellious queers who never want to get married and live your life, you know, doing whatever. You're Jake, basically, in that scenario. Or you're the get married, have babies, all of that kind of thing. And it's like, well, maybe you can be a delightful half and half, as David might say, and kind of have the party and the wedding and the shots for Patrick, and then not have the baby, and that's fine. And I really love that the show just addressed that and talked about that. And that also for nobody else, having babies was like a major end game issue in the show either, which
it is unusual to see like a conversation between a couple on TV where one person has planned to have children and the other hasn't. It's unusual to see the person who planned to have them change their mind.
Yes. Yeah.
Because it's subverting that expectation that, you know, in order to be a proper family unit, there has to be children involved, which is really refreshing.
Yeah. And the idea that if you're the person who's saying no to that, you're denying the other person something, rather than the other way around, which is like, well, you're forcing that on them. And it's a really like, yeah, it's a nice reversal of that. I'm by the way forever Moira when Jocelyn has the baby and she's like, do you want to hold it? And she's like, I can see it from here. Like, she's literally just like even on the other side of the room.
We have some lovely comments. Kay says they agree with Heather, waiting for more. Loved this book, now to reread and rewatch. And Ayushi also says, I agree too. I'm still currently reading it and taking a lot of notes. Emily, loving it.
Lovely.
I think we have one final question before we officially sign off from Abs. Do you have a favorite queer moment in the show that feels queer to you without it being explicitly presented that way? Oh, sorry, it's Haley, Abs' girlfriend. We love it.
Hello, Haley. Oh, interesting. I think for me, I don't know if it feels, it might feel queer to some people, but not to others, if that makes sense. But it's when in Happy Ending, Patrick just accepts what's happened with the masseuse and kind of, it's fine, and like, it's not fine, but it is fine, that kind of thing, that David has had a happy ending from the masseuse. But it's this idea, and I've heard Dan Levy talk about this as well, of like, for them, sex and love is two separate entities. And it's that idea of like, that's not a betrayal. It's like, it's a thing I'm annoyed at you about right this second in that instance. It's like, what the hell? But it's like, even if it was a betrayal in a more conscious way, it's like, it's not, because they're two very separate things and they cross over. But that's a very queer sensibility about marriage, I feel, and that diverts from what we were talking about just now, the idea of the very heteronormative model of that, in that, yes, they are married, but if something like that had happened, you know, 6 months down the line, it wouldn't mean they've split up, because in their mind, it's not the same thing as like emotionally betraying you. Or even to like link that back to when David like sends Patrick off on a date with the other guy, even though he comes back and he doesn't want to do it. Those little things feel very queer in the construction of a relationship, that even when they get it wrong, because they do, it's the idea of kind of, we're not conforming to the traditional way that, again, if this was Friends, that would have gone a completely different way type scenario. And that for me was one of those moments. And it's a lovely little thing that if you don't think about these things, or if you're maybe not from a queer background, that sort of thing is just like, it's a funny, sweet moment in the last episode, but you can take it and sort of, you know, think about the bigger impacts of it. And I like that about the show and that moment.
Yeah, absolutely. What a great show. What a great book. What a great chat, Emily. Thank you to Lighthouse for hosting the event, Myri, especially for leading on tech, because I would have been absolutely hopeless. Emily Garside for writing the book and giving us some really brilliant insight into queer relationships, compassion, TV futures. And also thank you to Dan Levy for his Met Gala look. Yes. All right, we're going to sign off there. Thank you to everybody also for tuning in from all across the world. And from us, it's best wishes and